Please welcome Wes Moore, author and Robin Hood Foundation CEO, John N. Friedman, Harvard University's Opportunity Insights founding co-director, and Larry Platt, the Philadelphia Citizen co-founder.
Welcome, fellow citizens. I'm here at the beautiful Fittler Club in Center City, Philadelphia, with two superstar guests on the front lines of the poverty and opportunity revolution. I'm going to try and not be a fanboy because these guys are literally superstars in this field. The first thing I want to do is just give a quick introduction to them. It's really my deep honor to welcome both of them. Wes Moore, CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, best-selling author of the Other Wes Moore and 5 Days: The Fiery Reckoning of an American City, both of which are available for purchase through our festival bookseller, Head House Books, a local independent bookseller, and Dr. John Friedman, professor of economics at Brown University and co-founder with Raj Chetty of Opportunity Insights at Harvard University. His cutting-edge research offers new ways to understand the efficacy of poverty and opportunity interventions. I'm just so excited about this conversation. So we're calling this the Opportunity Agenda, guys, because Philadelphia is ground zero for poverty, the worst poverty in the nation, the worst child poverty in the nation, the worst deep poverty in the nation. And it's as if this has always been thus. I can't tell you how many press conferences I've attended where we're going to announce a war on poverty and the needle doesn't move. You're both innovators in this field, and I wanted to get to some of your ideas. But before I do that, if you could just give us a sense of how you came to be in your life, this frontline worker in this fight. Just briefly, and Wes, a lot of us know your story intimately from your writing. But Wes, if you can begin about just give us a quick sense of like how you came to be this guy.
Yeah, well, first and honestly, let me say, Larry, it's a real joy to be with you and to be with all of you. And honestly, I follow John's work so closely. I think it is some of the most important work that's being done in the field right now when it comes to really understanding and really drilling down to literally the block level about how can we increase economic mobility. So the chance to be with both y'all today is a real honor. And it's interesting because I now run one of the the largest poverty fighting organizations in the country. But I'm a person who honestly came into it just truthfully very skeptical of philanthropy, and skeptical of what was the role of philanthropy in all this. But I think the thing that I really came to appreciate when Robin Hood first came up in an approach about it, and also how I think we've really tried to view the work, is there is a measure of complicity that each and every one of us own when it comes to understanding the measures of the discrepancies, when it comes to understanding that we have had policies that have been put in place for generation after generation that have put and kept people in this measured state of economic despair and poverty. And so there's a measure of collective complicity that we all have to own. There's also a measure of collective buy-in that we all have to be able to lead in when it comes to being able to address these fundamental issues. And the way that I look at it, and the way that we try to approach this work is poverty and economic despair is not something that shows itself in one way. It really reminds you in every way, in the way that you live, that you are different and that you are no one's constituent, that you're no one's priority. In the air that you are breathing, in the water you are drinking, in the schools you are attending, in the transportation assets you have or don't, in the way you're policed. And so all these fixtures and all these functions then become things that we have to think holistically and collectively about how we address it. And I think, both in my own personal journey and then now in the work that we do, it really is how do we attack these enemies in the way that they show themselves, which is holistically.
John, what about you? What drove you to be this guy now today?
Well, thanks so much, Larry. It's really great to be with you here today, and Wes as well. I mean, to give you the view from the flip side of the coin, a lot of what motivates us in our work is simply to be as helpful as we can be to you and your colleagues and other organizations that are, as you say, kind of putting forth funding these poverty alleviation programs in the hopes that we can escape this cycle of a lack of opportunity. I grew up in a relatively privileged environment, but it was an environment where, as I became more aware of the world, there was a lot of inequality, not just globally, but even, quite locally. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, has Harvard University. It has some of the, most expensive houses around, but also it has public housing, and it has marginalized communities, and it has public schools that struggle to provide opportunity to those individuals. And so as I was kind of coming of age as an economist, the revolution that was ongoing was the data revolution. We had more and more data to bring to bear on questions, really all questions in economics, but the question of how can we help children from diverse backgrounds achieve all that they can be in society? How can we break down these barriers that seem to limit opportunity for so many? That was the question that really attracted me. And that's a question that we've tried to come at from a number of different angles in our research, whether it's thinking about neighborhoods, thinking about schools, thinking about social capital. I think that's really the defining question of our time.
Wes, you gave a recent interview where you said that something to the effect of that we ought to retire the word poverty because it allows for othering. I'm paraphrasing, but I thought that's what you were getting at. And I was really interested in that. And that's one of the reasons that sparked my thinking that opportunity, the word opportunity, is actually a better word. And it's interesting that John's entity is the Opportunity Insights. Can you elaborate on that? The way that we talk about this issue might not be the most smart way to actually solve the problem.
Yeah, and it's not to pretend that poverty doesn't exist, because it does, right? But the thing I think we have to remember is that words do matter in all of this. And I think about it even in the context when I hear people talk about poor people, and we'll use the term poor people as if that is just as if that was a birthright. Poor people this, poor people that, as if that is their claim, or that is their life station. Poverty is a societal creation. Poverty is something that we as a collective, we tolerate it, right? We tolerate and we accept just how much pain in our neighbors are we willing to accept. And so how then do we think about reversing it? How then do we think about this idea of looking at opportunity, looking at sustainable economic mobility? Because the thing that we also see about poverty that makes it so complicated, it's not just that it's there, is that the data also continues to reinforce the fact that it's so sticky. That the data continues to reinforce the fact that it's almost this seemingly omnipresent force that continues to pull people in, that even as the research at Opportunity Insights continues to pull together, if a person is born into a state of poverty, their chances of actually dying in a state of poverty are unnecessarily high. Right. And so how then do we change that dynamic, that we are looking at this idea of sustainable measures of economic mobility? How are we looking at this idea that we can create where ambition and opportunity actually have a chance to meet each other? That's the kind of society and the kind of frame that I think we need to be able to internalize and inherit. And part of that, though, means how are we changing the language that we're using? That this is not saving poor people. This is about understanding this dynamic of poverty that society continues to introduce and continues to weigh upon individuals, that makes it so oftentimes generational and oftentimes so predictable. And so that really is the frame that I think gives us a galvanizing force to be able to combat this larger ill.
When I heard you say that before, what it brought home for me was the fact that it's a very elemental point, but we forget it, that there's nothing natural about the state of things, that these are the result of specific decisions and policies that have been made over decades, centuries.
That's right.
And it would do well for us to remember that in our politics. We don't often. And John, Wes talked about economic mobility. And when you dive into the Opportunity Insights research, it's kind of like, for nerds like me, it's kind of like an acid trip, because it's just like amazing. You demonstrate sort of, this might be too strong, but the death of the American dream. There are some statistics. The American dream is more alive in Canada than it is in the United States in terms of the lower quartile being able to rise to the top quartile. Can you give us a sense of just how endangered the American dream is?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the ways in which these new data that I talked about have really shown their power in helping us understand not just what is going on in this country, but first, as you mentioned, how it compares to others, but also it's a big country, and the challenges that we face in Philadelphia are not the same as the challenges we face in Fargo, North Dakota, are not the same as the challenges we face on the Rio Grande Valley. So, one statistic just to kind of motivate this conversation is our best effort in data to approximate the American dream. And we do that by calculating the chance that each child born since 1940 would grow up and have a higher standard of living than his or her parents did a generation earlier. And, we do all the inflation adjusting and all of that. But the takeaway message is that in the early period for those children growing up right after World War II, it was a near certainty that they would achieve the American dream by this measure. 90% of children had a higher standard of living than their parents did. Over time, though, once you get down to the years when Wes and I were born, that probability falls to be literally no better than a coin flip. So that we've seen for too many Americans the opportunity to succeed and to build on the achievements of the last generation are really out of reach. And if you ask then, why is that the case? Why is it that in this recent generation, there are not those same opportunities as there were before? It really comes down to the fact that we've not had equitable growth. An enormous share of economic growth in this country has accrued to those individuals at the top of the income distribution and to those children who started out at the top of the income distribution, whereas median wages have been essentially flat for the past 40 years. We've seen, a few pockets of growth, but it's been really the exception rather than the norm. And in fact, incomes at the bottom of the income distribution seem even to have fallen. And so I think that just highlights the ways in which we can still be a great country. We are still creating great innovations and growth. The problem is just it's not accruing in an equitable way.
You also, I read one study that you did where you mapped Seattle and literally, almost as Wes said, almost on a block by block basis. And one of the things that you found is that even among students of all the same statistics, neighborhoods within a mile of each other were showing vastly different outcomes. And I guess one of the conclusions was that social capital is at least as important as education in determining outcome. Can you explain what social capital is and why that matters so much?
Sure. So social capital is the extent to which individuals are engaged in the community. And that can be through clubs, through churches, through athletic groups, or even more in informal ways through block parties and block groups. It's the extent to which communities are more than the sum of its parts, is the way I think about social capital. And when we look at the data, just as you mentioned, we find just enormous variation across blocks in a given city. There are many places in the US where you can literally cross a street and go from a place that's a relatively high opportunity area to a place that's a relatively low opportunity area, not just in the span of a mile, but in the span of, a couple hundred yards. We also see enormous differences in outcomes by race. We see that Black children, especially Black men growing up in the same neighborhood with the same kind of family income, same family education, kind of same whatever else you want, have lower opportunities when they grow up than their white peers. And so I think that when we try to understand how can it be that the opportunities for children differ so much by race in the same place, or differ so much when one goes, a 5-minute walk in one direction or another, the support from community that either is there or isn't there seems to be a really critical factor. And it's really that, alongside education, that kind of pop out from the data as those factors which are present in high opportunity neighborhoods and not present in low opportunity neighborhoods. And that especially appears to be a problem for Black men, where probably due to policing and the cycle of lack of opportunity, there just are not as many Black men present in those communities. You can look at a statistic: what share of households are single parents? And that's something that correlates incredibly highly with the lack of opportunity for Black men across this country.
Yeah. I think that is so fascinating. And Wes, as John was talking, he was really describing the other Wes Moore. I mean, that is the story of your life in a way, right?
That's right. And and I think it also really underscores and highlights something that the data is reinforcing, something that for many folks, for many of us that came up in communities that were intentionally neglected, that we knew, and the data also continues to reinforce it. And that is this idea that race matters in all of this. Where we've seen how just in 2020, we've watched these twin crises throw themselves at our doorstep. The first really was this introduction of COVID-19 that has had absolutely disastrous health and economic impacts on our society. And the other was this very unneeded reminder that policing is not the same in every community. That the pitch of a siren sounds different depending on what neighborhood you grew up in. But the reality of both of these two crises is that despite the fact that they were very different, they really did expose very much the same truth. While COVID-19 has impacted everybody, it didn't impact everybody equally. You look at the fact that people of color contracted COVID-19 at twice the rate, also died at twice the rate. You look at the fact that police reform is necessary in all communities. But we did watch, George Floyd's being named to a much longer list that includes names like Michael Brown and Philando Castile and Freddie Gray and Anthony Anderson and Chris Brown and Tyrone West and Walter Scott and Sean Bell and Eric Gardner and Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and Laquan McDonald and Tamir Rice and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin. And the list goes on. That dealing with COVID is not just simply about the discovery of a vaccine. And that dealing with policing is not simply about banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. That we are talking about a reality that race in this work does matter. And even as John and his OI has really done a brilliant job of highlighting that if you look at a Black child who's born to parents in the top income quintile is just as likely to fall in the bottom income quartile in adulthood as they are to stay in the top quintile, which is completely the opposite of what we see with white children. The fact that, a college degree increases lifetime earnings by nearly $1 million, but research shows that Black college graduates on average earn less than white high school dropouts. So our ability to be able to be honest about what the data continues to show us, our ability to understand that these splits in the road and these splits in the lives, and even as was highlighted with the other Wes Moore, that luck should not have to be a prerequisite as to where a child ends up. Luck should not have to be something that people are relying on. And we're never going to be able to fulfill the type of societal hopes and aims and dreams that we're all looking for if we're okay with cherry picking. And we're okay with the idea that some are going to naturally make it and some are naturally not. And in many cases, because of variables that are not of their own choosing and not of their own doing. That's the type of thing that we societally have to wrestle with. And we have to be honest when it comes to what is the lens that we're trying to put this, this equity measure on.
It occurs to me that our audience, I'm assuming that they know what the Other Wes Moore was about. Can you tell us?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Who was the Other Wes Moore?
So they don't think I'm talking in a third person. So the Other Wes Moore was a story where I had just received the Rhodes Scholarship, and the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote this article about this local kid who, despite having significant childhood challenges, was now on my way to England for this Rhodes Scholarship. And at the same time, they were writing a whole series of articles about four guys who walked into a jewelry store, and in a botched armed jewelry store robbery, ended up killing an off-duty police officer. And there was a 12-day national manhunt for those four guys, and finally, the final two were caught actually in Philadelphia. And one of the people that the police were looking for that was eventually captured and tried and convicted and sentenced was a guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And the more I learned about him, the more I learned about his story, the more I realized how much more we had in common than just our names, where we were around the same age, both grew up in single-parent households. In fact, by the time he was last arrested, we were living blocks away from each other. And there were questions I wanted to ask, and I knew he was the only one that can answer them. So one day I just decided to write him a note. And a month later, I got a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution, where Wes was just starting his life sentence. And that one letter turned into dozens of letters. Those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits. And he really pushed me and prompted me to write it. And one of the big takeaways that I got from it was that, that the chilling truth was that his story could have been mine. The tragedy is that my story could have been his. And the other thing was something that he reminded me, we were talking about Baltimore, and we're talking about, and I asked him, I said, do you think that we're products of our environments? And he paused and he looked back at me. And this is when I went to go visit him. And he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And as soon as he said that, I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. And someone said, it's a real shame you lived up to your expectations and Wes didn't. And I said, actually, the real shame is that we both did. We both ended up exactly where we thought we would at some point, because the expectations that people have of themselves, they don't come from nowhere. The expectations people have of themselves come from the expectations that people have of them.
It's a beautiful, moving work, but it's also, as we're talking about this, sort of the narrative embodiment of John's research.
That's right.
I mean, it's sort of stunning, because you had interventions were made in your life by those social capital interventions. I think if your mom, who's an amazing character, if she doesn't send you to our own Valley Forge Military Academy, who knows, right? And John, I wanted to get to that because one of the things that blew me away about your research is the degree to which, when you map cities for opportunity hotspots, basically, and it shows that we're not necessarily investing in the right neighborhoods, the low opportunity neighborhoods. Can you explain? And I think there was, an example of this might have been in Seattle, where you identified landlords who can to increase voucher programs. So landlords in high opportunity areas were diversifying and offering opportunity housing to citizens. Can you expand on that, on how we can invest in opportunity on a granular level?
Sure. So this is a program, you're exactly right. It's in Seattle, but it's now being rolled out in a number of other cities. Tries to understand at the ground level, what's the root of so much of the housing segregation that we see in many cities across this country. We spend billions of dollars a year on housing vouchers, which have the notional goal of exactly this, trying to provide families the opportunity to live in a neighborhood which, in whatever way is appropriate for that family will help them. But what we often see is that families use their vouchers to reinforce rather than break down these barriers of segregation. And what we wanted to do is understand what those barriers were and how we could help families overcome those barriers to let them have somewhat of a broader choice that might help them create that opportunity for their children to break the cycle of poverty, to create those expectations that Wes talked about.
Wes, I think you may be the best in America at deconstructing. It's become fashionable now for the media suddenly to talk about systemic racism, but very rarely do they define it. And you sort of walk us through what that term means. I thought of you, I heard you make this point that the CARES Act, which I was very excited that our government finally did something, right, and reacted. But the CARES Act was actually, I heard you deconstruct how that was a product of systemic bias. Can you walk us through what the definition of systemic racism? Because until we have agreed on that basic set of facts, we can't get to interventions.
Yeah, and I think about something like the CARES Act, where you're absolutely right, where the idea that we did something was important, and the CARES Act, the truth is that the CARES Act saved lives at a time when we needed it. It also left millions of people out, and in a very intentional fashion, because we are still not looking at all of this work through a lens of equity, and particularly who are the ones who are the most needing of that support, the most vulnerable that we have in our society. You think about the CARES Act in particular, where there was a cash assistance element to the CARES Act, which was important at that time. Going into prior to COVID-19, over 40% of the population could not afford a $400 shock with cash. And that shock came, and it was a lot more than $400. So it was necessary to have a cash assistance parameter inside of how we're talking about the CARES Act. And people did receive some form of cash assistance unless you were undocumented. Because if that was the case, even if you were working and paying taxes, you didn't benefit from the CARES Act, from the cash assistance element. If you were part of a mixed status household, even if you were working and paying taxes, you didn't benefit from a cash assistance perspective. If you were a student and living with your parents, and even if you were working, did not benefit. If you were working, even if you're working multiple jobs, but not making enough to hit the tax filing threshold, there was no cash assistance element to you. And so when we're talking about these elements of how do we add an equitable lens into the way we think about this, part of my idea and philosophy around it is we have to stop talking about it like it's a personalized thing, because that's the trouble that I think we oftentimes get into, and what make these conversations so complicated to have. When people say, well, talking about race and systemic racism, it's one of the trickiest things we can do. It's not one of the trickiest. It's the trickiest, because there has to be an element of understanding that this is still very much a nation, and the truth is that this is still a nation that was born on elements of a racial hierarchy. Like, that is the origins. That it is a history and a culture and a history of a country that was built on stolen land with stolen labor, right? That is our history. We have to be honest about that and accept that if we're going to be able to move on and think about what solutions we have going forward. But oftentimes when people talk about racism, they think about it exclusively in these ideas of individual acts, right? Where it's like, well, this person uses the N-word, that is racist. Got it, yes. This person attends a white supremacist rally, racist. Got it, yes. However, racism is not just an act. It is a system. It's a system that allows the kind of disparities that we talked about to exist for as long as they are existing in. It's a system that allows for employers to be just as likely to hire a white person recently released from prison as a Black applicant with no criminal history. That's a system. It's a system that allows the fact that race is one of the most reliable predictors of life outcomes, including life expectancy, educational attainment, income, wealth, physical and mental health, maternal mortality. So our ability to be able to attack systemic racism is not an element to play gotcha. It's not an element to play I told you so. It's not an element to make people feel bad. But it's to understand that what we are going after are not just individual acts. This is bigger than this. These are systems. And the only way for us to then be able to attack systems is to be able to properly unpackage how exactly were the systems built up, what exactly are keeping the systems elevated, and then how and what are the proper mechanisms that we can then put in place to go from this idea of why is it for certain people is Opportunity Insights, research continues to highlight, as research across the board continues to highlight, the things that we can do that can have an oversized impact on creating levels of economic parity and fairness. And how are we thinking about initiatives like the expansion of the child tax credit, which in many ways could actually be one of the most powerful ways to address the racial wealth gap that we have in our society, instituting elements of whether it's baby bonds or expansions of EITC. Like, these are policy recommendations that we can make that will have a universal impact on our society, particularly the most vulnerable, but in many ways actually do a great job of addressing the larger elements of systemic racism that still do very much exist, because they will end up benefiting and significantly increasing the life prospects of those who oftentimes have fallen behind in both conversation, in both word and deed, in terms of how we're creating opportunity within our society.
I think that's fascinating. Final question, you guys, is this citizen has an audience of doers and civic patriots and CEOs, a really dynamic, engaged group. And I wonder if you have advice for them about what we all should be doing. And along those lines, also, if you had a magic wand and could achieve one thing in this fight to extend opportunity, what would it be? So twofold: advice for our audience about how to make a difference, and secondly, if you could, what one act would you, if you had Trump-like dictatorial powers that you could, I want to retract that, because
I'm not really sure I want to take Trump as the model of efficacy of dictatorial powers in this.
Well, yeah, and it's basically calling you deluded. So I don't want to do that. But if you had one magical power that you could enact, what would it be?
Mark, you go first, John.
So I think that I've been thinking a lot about how one responds to this crisis recently. And as Wes has noted, it's something which in many ways has exacerbated the already wide and worrying inequalities that exist in our society. And so I think as we think about the next round of stimulus, as we think about how we reform our system, right, it's not just enough to try to kind of hold the line. I think we need to think about how we can proactively start to combat those inequalities, because kind of just holding things where they are is not sufficient. That's not going to get us where we need to be. And so certainly I think that's the broad advice that I would give, is always think about kind of how we can be intentional about combating those inequalities rather than just maintaining the status quo. I think if there's one thing I would do, in my mind, despite all our talk about social capital, I think that education is the policy lever that has the greatest potential. And whether that's in K through 12 education, broadening the opportunities and the quality of schooling for all children, or trying to reinforce for selective colleges and universities the value in economic and racial diversity, to try to think about how they're allocating all those slots. It's really something that our work has shown is kind of a pathway to opportunity, but it's a pathway that's not open to as many students as we would like it to be open to.
Yeah, I would echo exactly what John says, and I would ask folks, particularly for the people who are the business owners and the CEOs and the ones who are thinking, about how exactly do I respond in this moment. I think it's important that we remind all of our CEOs and business owners, and also for them to remind their employees that this is not a 2020 thing. Right. The idea of actually being able to have a real racial equity lens, the idea of being able to understand the economic impacts, the long tail economic impacts of COVID-19. This is not this is going to be the thing I'll focus on for 2020. And then 2021 will introduce something new. This is about how can we use this moment to completely change our lens? How do we make sure that at the same time when we're doing our briefings on revenue and margin increase, that at the same time at every single board meeting that you're also talking about what exactly are you doing to promote equity in the organization? That it should just come just as a natural. This is just a new dynamic and a new phenomenon. That we don't forget about the power of the business community in all this. People sometimes forget, if you think about back to the times of the apartheid era, there have been activists and people who have been advocating for the removal and the ending of that brutal and inhumane regime for a very long time. But the thing that really helped to accelerate it was when it was the business community who then started saying, you know what, maybe I'll start looking to divest because I cannot continue to support this. People had been arguing about the renaming of a Washington football team for decades. And you know what actually turned it? Was when FedEx and other companies started saying, I don't really feel comfortable having my name on their stadium anymore. So the business community and our CEOs have to understand that right now we are in a moment and we are in a situation where leadership is going to show itself in a lot of different ways. And sometimes the title, we see people with no title at all, or who haven't historically had a big title, that are absolutely changing the world. And we see people with some really, really big titles who are doing absolutely nothing. And this moment, frankly, is just too bright for them. And we've seen it. And so what becomes the business communities and what becomes our business leaders' ability to be able to say, we are not just concerned about our quarterly earnings, and we're not just concerned about what our current shareholders feel, but there are real other issues that we have an ability to move on that are going to have a long-term impact on the society that we exist in. How can we get the business community to talk about things like what are we doing to reform our education system? Having real conversations about things that we should have been having a conversation about long ago. Things like everything from school years to school days to how did we find ourselves so flat-footed in the fall, where we still have upwards of 20% of children who do not have consistent Wi-Fi or hardware tablets to be able to do their work. That's something the business community can have a significant impact on. How can we do things like have the business community advocating for adjustments and enhancements to the child tax credit, where people would say, well, what does that have to do with your business model? And the answer is everything, if it means we can actually make our society better. And so this is a chance where I think for a lot of our leaders, our individual citizens and our business leaders and our CEOs, to really redefine what it means to be a social advocate and really redefine what it means to be a leader in this time and in this space. We've seen the ones that have done it, that have really tried to prove it and push on it thus far. And I think that's going to have significant impacts on their business and their business models, on the type of employees they can recruit, the type of employees they can retain, about are people proud to be part of your organization or not? And so that's the kind of thing that you're hoping that this does not just become a 2020 thing. And this is not just about blacking out your Instagram page, but how are we putting a real philosophy, a true intentional governing philosophy in terms of the way we're talking about progress moving forward?
That's a brilliant point, and it's something that we've really paid attention to at the Citizen. I was all for taking down the statue of Frank Rizzo, but if that's all we do, that alone doesn't help a single Black or brown family. And my fear is that this will be a fad, and we'll go back to so you put it much more eloquently than I could. But let's end on that challenge to our business community and all our citizens, because citizenship is not a spectator sport. And voting is we had great turnout in the city of Philadelphia, 65%. It's a shame that 65% qualifies as great turnout. But voting is only the beginning, hopefully, of a renewed civic spirit. I can't thank you guys enough. I called you superstars at the beginning. You exhibited that. Thank you so much. When the world comes back, we want to bring you to Philadelphia personally.
A special thank you to our sponsors.